tonight is about drawings, but drawings in a peculiar way, and it's a particular selection of drawings, and it have to do, in a way, it was triggered by an interesting Q&A that I have recently, right before the quarantine. The last lecture I gave was in Princeton, and Silvia Levin, who was in the audience, because I've been saying for a long time that in my own work, in my own interest, plans and sections and drawings, I was not interested in working through drawings. I was interested in to work through image and animations and so on. And she made an interesting distinction, which she was saying that I should be talking about drawings without lines. So that triggered in my head to rethink about a little bit about this conversation about drawing. So what I want to talk tonight for a bit, and then we can engage in conversation, is a peculiar collection through different moments in history about drawings. And drawings, what I would call that they were always flirting with an inside the discipline, but also they were looking into the edge of it, and how that informed, in a way, the vocabulary or the language of each architect. Many times we talk about that the language of architects, our language is to drawings. And of course, discourse and what we said and what we add in conversations is part of it, it's part of the discourse, but the true language of architecture is drawings. So if we start with somebody like Palladio, which is something that, in particular in the Anglo-Saxon culture of education of architecture, is a name that keeps popping up, particularly because Peter Eisman mentioned it many times, but we have many of our faculty that mentioned that. And I always thought that what is fascinating in many ways about Palladio, and what fascinates us, is not so much the buildings themselves, Villa La Rotonda, but it was the way that he would construct and understood drawings at the time. So if you think about it, we can navigate the whole history of architecture that has been expanded through the fetishism of the celebration of the obsession for many architects to work to drawings, to figure it out, the architectural ambition. So Piranesi, and what was known as the Piranesian space, it was an architect that mostly worked to the idea of perspective, and the idea what I would argue that in many ways was the first architect to really embrace the possibility of the image for the vehicle of the production of architecture, and to understand drawings in a different way, drawings as the construction of a parallel image. Of course, if you think on people like Goulet, is also another architect. And of course, many of these examples are related to unbuilt projects and related to speculative ways to think about architecture. So in a way, the drawing became the reality of that. And the idea of a speculative architecture and the drawing as a vehicle for that. So in many ways, we have this obsession over time from many architects, and some of them are seminal figures, and some of them are canonic figures like Mies van der Rohe, and the way that he will start to work with this very abstract and ethereal drawings, in which they are almost devoid from any context, or they're devoid if you compare with anybody else, all the other architects from that time, how he was operating. And there was a relation in which the representation became a desire to the way that architecture should be, like some of these perspective images, collages for the pavilion, and the way that the plan for the Farnsworth House. So there was a direct correlation between the spirit and the ambition of the architecture and how the drawing started to express that. So if we move forward and we think in the 60s, and we think in Archigran, and we think about the eruption of pop culture and the notion to embrace pop and so on. So how mediums and other forms of expression in relation to graphics, and maybe that's the right way to start to talk about many of these examples, the idea of graphics, not the idea necessarily of drawings. Are also, what do we mean by drawings? Are we talking about plans and section? Are we talking about the two-dimensional drawings? Are we talking about sketch? Are we talking about perspective? So all of these things is a way for the field, for the architecture to start to embrace level of freedoms on how to liberate from the canon or from the boundaries in which the architecture operates. But at the same time, you have examples like James Stirling, who will take the opposite approach, in which he will start to really explore architecture through axonometrics. And there is a direct correlation between his drawings and his building. And the idea to understand these super high technical buildings, almost devoid them from authorship. Not so different than the early days of computers. So there was a desire in which these hyper-technical drawings, axonometric, as a way to start to create a mechanism in which the drawing is the architecture, and the architecture, the drawing is representing a desire and aspiration of the architecture to be, but also you can argue that the drawing is the way that the architecture will be. And if you think about somebody like Stirling, it's impossible to think of the evolution of the work of somebody like Tom Main and Morphosis without that. So one could argue that the work of Morphosis and the same way that the work of Eisman is related to Palladio and Morphosis working to Stirling, they all one way or another are embracing the drawing as a mechanism to keep pushing the possibility of autonomy of architecture and the idea that the drawings are worth to explore. There is also a practical aspect about this. I mean, Tom Main will be the first one to admit the part and the over-elaborated drawings and try to figure out every part of it. It was also for the lack of opportunity to have buildings. So in a way, the drawings was a way to create that world, to create that the imagination of the world in which architecture could be and how the architecture could operate within that. But also you can see in their own trajectory Morphosis, taking what it was a highly technical language that was inherited from Stirling, start to push into a whole other territory, and of course get informed from also, not popular culture per se, but other cultures. A culture that came from car design or machining design or industrial machines drawings, or the hyper-articulation, hyper-explosion of things. And of course, as the work keeps evolving and the notion of publication and the celebration of drawing, not as only as a fetishism, but as tools of obsession, but also as a way to give a space to new possibilities for architecture, they will keep pushing the boundaries in relation to that. So later on, they will start to overlap and mix drawings with photos of models. And they start to overlap and start to create this multi-dimensional. So if you guys, some of you were when he did the talk a couple of weeks ago, you will understand that there is a clear correlation in the way that he understands architecture, in the way that he understands representation of it. So in many, many ways, the representation in all these examples I'm giving you of parallel life of drawings from architecture is a way for representation to project the possibilities, to explore possibilities, to also navigate, and in a way to be completely unapologetic of the artistic dimension of architecture. I have to say that this doesn't apply to every architect that we know or any architect that we admire. This is a peculiar group of architects and a particular trajectory in which there is a complete commitment to this notion of the idea of the lexicon of architecture through the mechanism of representation. But you will see, for example, in this image of Morphosis, that there is also an embrace about technology, how computers start to incorporate new elements, but there is a patina, there is a genealogy, there is a genetic code that keep evolving through that. And if we take around the same time that Stirling and the early work of Morphosis, in the opposite side, you can have somebody like John Hediuk, in which the idea of the poetic and the idea of almost to create an alphabet of forms or language as a very personal, very meticulous, very myopic way to relate to drawings, it would produce a completely different also context for how he understood architecture. That's been said, when some of those mechanisms needed to be conveyed into a kind of a conventional architectural language, he will also be obsessed with this notion of axonometric. There was this battle between the notion of authorship and how much you detach yourself, or how much you remove yourself from the drawing. It has been a fascinating battle in many, many of these examples. And I'm talking about many of the architects that we're talking about. A little bit later, in the early 80s, late 70s, Daniel Libeskind will take some of this a step even further. He will completely detach the notion of recognition, the notion of legibility. So there is not, you can recognize this that is made out of architecture elements, architecture understanding, flatness, axonometric perspective, plans, all collapse into one, draw with incredibly precise, with straight lines and rules and rulers. It's not a sketch, it's not a free form exercise, it's an incredibly precise one, but it's one in which, again, the ambition is to liberate the constraint of drawing chess as a technical instrument, or drawing chess as a mechanism to convey orthogonal behavior, but to really explore. Of course, Daniel Libeskind, as many of you may know, as many of you will know, he didn't have a formal training as an architect. He had training as a musician. So there is also this notion of notation, the kind of a musical notation, kind of a John Cage-like in the chamber works. And this is Micromegas, and this is chamber works, another series of work. This one is more about the space, and this one is more about the line and the overlapping of line. And of course, it will have direct consequences, and sometimes very successful, like in the Jewish Museum, and some other times it will become like a caricature. A remarkable and unique example in this pedigree on these people, this group of people that are exploring that, is Zaha Hadid. The early work of Zaha Hadid was incredibly influenced by suprematism, and particularly Malevich and Russian constructivism paintings. So from her early days in her career, even as a student, Zaha Hadid was obsessed with the idea, again, to create a language that didn't belong to the traditional architecture, but they introduced the possibility and introduced the notion of new spaces and new forms, but ultimately to modify the reality in which she wanted architecture to operate. So she will spend hours and hours working in this massive painting. These paintings are huge, in which, again, they're composed and they're organized by architectural elements, but they're also free from that. So you can see pieces of plans inserted into the painting. Some of them are more abstract, some of them are more specific. They will start to collapse perspective, multiple scales of perspectives. This one is one example of that. And of course, the early work that she built, there is a clear aspiration and reflection to try to capitalize and create a physical presence of of that body of work that was coming from the world of painting. Of course, Ren Koolhaas and Elias and Zoe Zengeris were teachers of Zaha Hadid. So the notion, again, we cannot always say that these are drawings. These, as I said, they are graphics, mechanism of representation, and of course, OMA piggybacking on Super Studio, the idea of the collage and the photography and the hyper drawing as a way to understand a massive approach to the notion of architecture. So the work of Zaha Hadid is not exactly that, but is influenced by that and is liberated by that. This was one of her seminal projects and seminal pieces. This is the peak in Hong Kong. It was a competition in Hong Kong that she won. And she won it using a very unusual body of mechanism representation. So her presentation didn't have what we understood as conventional sections, plans, and drawings. They were composed of a series of paintings. They were out of order. And these things that kind of resembles a plan, it has certain behaviors of a plan, but it's not fulfilled as a plan. So it's interesting also, like in the case of morphosis, and I think there are certain architects like Tom Main, Zaha Hadid, and others, that I would argue that before computers and so on, the way that they were operating is already pretty much in tune with computer would put this on steroids. They would this maximize. So when they start to see a transition, the work of Zaha Hadid, you can start to see the computer, the line drawings, and so on, to be exaggerated, extremely distorted. So again, there are traces, they are echoes of a body of work that was driven and it was established in a different kind of, a different pathology, if you like. This is a very early project. This is a competition that she did for the Prime Minister, I think in Ireland. And this was, again, one of those attempts in which he tried to hybridize traditional elements of architectural drawings and representation with more mechanism of painting or mechanism of very incredibly distorted perspective, like in the Russian suprematism and so on. It's a completely different feeling that the version that is much more recent on Zaha Hadid Architects. And this is a render of the building that they will do later. There's a fundamental difference between those desire to create parallel realities in which versus the render that try to create a projection of reality. They try to establish this is how reality will work. So I'm not saying that her work was better or worse. I just said it was very different in terms of the capacity of graphic representations and when to enhance and to explore, and absolutely convinced that her architectural language wouldn't exist without all that representation language she developed. I would argue the same about Morphosis, the same about Daniel Libeskind, about the same pretty much about every architect that I'm using in this sequencing. So I talk about OMA and the early work of OMA and the axonometric, and again, Stirling. So there is a lot of Moebius, a lot of family relationships going back and forth into these things. But I want to take a little bit sideways to also address the sketch and the idea of the playful or the doodling as an idea. Like this is some of the sketches of Kazuyo Sejima, which also, if you pay attention to her architecture, it has a quality of playful, it has a sense of a scale, and it has a sense of cartoonish elements that appear. So I would argue that even in this free-flowing, in this kind of a more sketchy, more personal, more signature way, there is a relation about that too. The same can be said about Frank Gehry. This is the Guggenheim, one of the early Guggenheim sketches. But there is a desire in which the sketch has this power of freedom that then they will navigate to other constructions. But it's not really the focus of what I'm interested in talking about this notion, but it's more about, as I talked about Mirages weeks ago, another fetishist and obsessive compulsive architect in relation to drawings. But more closer in time, people like Neil Denari and Wes Jones, these are drawings done before computers. So they are direct childs of Stirling, Morphosis, in this desire of the hyper-technical drawing as a way to figure it out, everything architecture, but also about the aesthetics of the architecture, and also that mechanical machining aspect of the representation is the aspiration that the architecture will be. So there is a massive desire to produce a synthesis between a drawing and the reality of architecture aspiration. I find that a super interesting problem and tension, and I think we all part of that. And for sure, in the culture of science, this is a culture that embrace that and push for that and gravitates towards that. Again, this is some of the early work of Neil Denari. This was done by hand. This was not done by computer. It's done with rapidograph and aerographs. So a lot of work was put into this. But if you talk to Neil, he will tell you that his earliest obsession was the notion that the drawings looked like they were done by a machine in the early work before machines. And this is when they start to transition between computers and not computers. So again, like in Morphosis, there is an intersection between the three-dimensionality and the render construction, and then a desire of a line drawing that the anchor, and it claims very clear, hold on, I'm an architect, this is architecture, let's don't monkey around. So it's an important tool, the signify and the meaning, because this is I would not call it a trap, but I will say it's an issue that architects, we all keep going back, and one way or another, we keep reinforcing that ambiguity, and we keep reinforcing that dichotomy. And this is much more recent work of Neil, which is when he fully embraced renders as a true independent autonomous mechanism of representation from the ambitions of architecture. Which it brings back to also a parallel series of things that, like I was talking in the 90s with Neil and Wes Jones were doing some of that. In the other hand, there were people like Greg Lynn and Jesse Rice, Hernán Komemoto, and Harry Rashid and Lisan Couture. They were really fully embracing animation software. And what was that? Part of that was also there was a massive detachment about the mechanism of representation moving to the mechanism of simulation. So this is some of the very early work of Greg Lynn when there was a series of manipulation of primitives and so on. But one of the fascinating things, there is a certain desire of order or composition and try to bring it back to language of architecture, either by inserting these cuts or orders of repetition and structure or sequencing or even evolution. It has a perspective. So even in the most abrupt disorganization in relation to the notion of graphics, it will still, architecture is powerful enough and the legacy and the weight of discipline is so powerful that it keeps bringing it back. So as the work evolves, then you will start to see a revisiting of the problem of the line and the problem of the line as a way to organize geometry, and the geometry is a way to organize form. So, and how that became three-dimensional. So even though in most of the cases there is a removal, there is a comeback, and removal and comeback. It's always like a permanent negotiation between innovation and speculation and the canon, and how we navigate that. And I think this is a problem that all of you and all of us, we are confronted on a regular basis when we work through these problems. Razor Memoto, as I said, Jesse and Nanako, they took a slightly different approach. They start to incorporate the notion of computers and technology, but they were committed to keep the significance of the line and the weight of the line. So they would really start to instead to do full-on solid renders, they will work with extreme complex wireframes and trying to understand and negotiate that the work that they were doing, was moving into kind of a contemporary territory, was working into the speculation of what animation software bringing to the table, but at the same time, indulging their own fetishism and obsession with the tradition of the discipline, which both of them are very, very much in tune with it. So it's a fascinating way to see that all the efforts and the gymnastics that they will go through to produce that series of relationships in which, not unlike when I was talking about Francis Bacon, not unlike Francis Bacon to really realize the notion that you can be contemporary and traditional, and that's not necessarily a contradiction, but there are ways and mechanisms and to navigate that. And even when they will do solid render, the solid renders are really desiring to be line drawings. They have that desire to be line drawing, which is something that I always find fascinating in architecture on other design. Is the idea when the desire of being something else than what it is evident. And of course, the overlapping and the overflux, the oversaturation of information. And even when they're doing it, at this one, you don't know if you're looking at a picture, a 3D print, or you don't know you're looking at a render, or you're looking at a wireframe. This ambiguity is crucial for them to understand their own desires. And again, it became a signature in which architecture became a representation of the representation. So that blur trajectory, which I would say it doesn't belong to the world of computer. I think it belongs to the world of attitude towards that. As I mentioned, in many of the architects I mentioned before, they were doing that way before, and centuries before we even knew what the computer was. So it's much more a way to understand that the drawing is a mechanism to which architecture will flourish. Now, there is another subtext, and there is another in between lines of this, which have to do with the notion of the diagram and the diagrammatic organization as a means of representation and as a means of production of architecture. So this is an interesting territory in which people like Bernard Cash, but particularly I would say Ben Van Berkel and Caroline Boss, UN Studio, they were really investing time and thinking into this. The notion of abstract formal, giving like a formal language to data, give a formal language to organization. So it's not just an architecture diagram, it's the idea to manipulate and organize the data that is coming from a world that has nothing to do with architecture, but because we are architects, we have to give it a shape and a form. And then if we are lucky, it can become like a proto-architecture and can become a mechanism. So this, something similar, one can be said about Asymptote of Hani Rashid and Lisan Couture. So there were all these series, and again, there's always this desire to step in and out of whatever the bubble of architecture disciplinary is, and how are those mechanisms. So how the computer and technology brought that, and you see people like Greg Lynn and Jesse Rice and Nanago trying to reconfigure and recook discipline with innovation, which people like Ben Van Berkel and Hani embracing to say this is also a mechanism to read data and to incorporate information into the process. And of course, then we have the issue of the image and the notion of render and the notion of what is the right amount of reality, how much real or fake we want this to be. This is a prototype for a Reebok store that Ali Rahim and Hena Jamel did in the early 2000s, that it was rendered by Dietmar Simone and Joel Kosinski, where he was called at that time KD Lab. Joel Kosinski became a fairly celebrated filmmaker, and Dietmar Simone operated in this. And they were really the first people to start to provide service of mental ray renders to firms. But one funny story about this project was, for a while, it was in a shopping guide tour in Shanghai, and the perception was that this project was built, even though the project never got built. So there was this kind of obsession and precision in these renders to start to create a reality, but also it's because reality started to look like images too. So you cannot have one versus another one. Another of the KD Lab renders is that they're the famous render for the Taurus house for Prescott Scott Cohen, which is an interesting case by himself, because this is an absolute obsessed architect with geometry, but also he would embrace the possibility of image and what image making can relate to those things, and how lines became surfaces, and the surface became a render, and the render is different than a drawing, and drawing is different than graphics. And of course, a model of that. And the idea of the physical model versus the virtual model, which is something that we all went through in the last part of the semester, the one that just finished, when some of you were working with renders that were trying to have the behavior of a physical model, because that was, in a way, the ethos of the studio that you were working. So these are fascinating issues in the sense that it changed how we operate in terms of representation simulation, but also it changing the outcome of architecture does. And of course, KD Lab went slightly off of architecture and started to work into commercials and produce commercials with Nike. And that brings us to the more contemporary world than we are, in which the tools, the language is the same. If you work in architecture, industrial design, or fashion, or video game, or film, we're using a common language. But going back to the relation of the drawings, line, renders, the work of David Rue and Karen Klein, and the installation, the proposal for PS1 MoMA, in which it was made out of rope, it was a kind of a clear representation of the wireframe, and the wireframe becoming a knot to become, so it was an ambition to construct a geometry, but it was a geometry that was produced by computational thinking that cannot be done by hand. So even the drawing is the image of a drawing. That's what I've been arguing for me, that drawings to me are something else today, and we shift from representation to simulation, even though when we are embracing that, and of course, all the ultra extrusions and some of the early works that they were doing in relation to that, which have a similar language of the rope, but clearly these are not lines any longer, they're lines with surfaces and something else. Or another of our faculty, Ramiro Díaz Granado, which he literally built lines and extrude lines in the gallery. So in this one, there was zero translation or zero mutation from the drawing in the computer to the construction of it. It was all the same. And in a way, the installation, I would argue, was a simulation of the computer or the simulation of the drawing. So, which brings me to the last part, which is, I think, what was triggered by that comment and that conversation with Sylvia Levin, which is to figure it out, what is what we mean when we talk about drawings, and what do we mean when we talk about images, and so on. And to me, in many ways, to make it overly simplistic, and this is maybe to spark the conversation moving to Q&A, is, in a way, I would call it the traditional representation is like an X-ray, which we are now in the territory of the MRI. So yes, they are still constructed by the representation and so on, but this idea of multiplicity and the idea of totality versus the idea of a partial series of information. And of course, this is fueled by entertainment industry, particles and coding and artificial intelligence and all the tools that we have available. And of course, animation that comes from Disney and so on, and hair and many other things. And you start to see this is the work of Kokuja, and you start to see how these also start to create other languages of saturations, and how hair and dirtiness and other mechanism of reality becomes in the production of the image. It's a drawing, it's a representation. So it's this kind of a ultra nebulous, cloudy sound, cloudy sound that I'm interested in. And also the notion of how animating thing can add or diminish the value of it, and how architecture can take full advantage of this and start to navigate. But as I said, even in, and I'm making a very little sample of my work, in my earlier work in 2005 and so on, even when I was not interested whatsoever in plan and section or composition and mutation, there is always a sense of, even when you work with animation, that the work kind of animation behaving like architectural qualities. Because at the end of the day, if you think in an architectural way, you're always going to be thinking in architectural terms, and the notion of the weight of the tradition is going to come to weight on you. That's what I really like Silvia's take about the idea of drawings without lines. But even though there are moments of the drawings, and again, the early animations were incredibly geometrical, and they were trying to really embrace that, because in a way, I was not, at least at the time, I was not fully committed to the idea to embrace image for the vehicle, for the production of geometry, for the production of architecture ultimately, and to really think of the image as autonomous for drawing. But now I'm really thinking about these things that Silvia was mentioning about drawings without lines. And so in the most recent work, I have no appetite whatsoever to make any concessions to conventions of drawings or anything like that. This is one of the shoes that we've been working recently. So right now it's just fully embracing the image as the representation. The image is our tool of mechanism of conversation. But of course, this is not an image like taking a photo. This is an image that you're constructing, that you're designing, that you're manipulating, and it has points, and it has lines in space, and things that you move, and it has texture that you attach. And the texture is not geometry, it doesn't exist. The texture is a visual effect, but it adds to the ambition of in this case, a product design effect that is not different than that ambition that the thing was trying to, in the early work I was talking from other architects, that mechanism to work through drawings, representation, to animation, to image, whatever you call it, is the alphabet, is the language through which you are developing and deploying your architecture. Anyway, that's what I have for you guys tonight.